So, you've seen the trailers, the teasers, and posters for the upcoming The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. But with this series taking place thousands of years before The Lord of the Rings, you may be asking yourself, what does this have to do with the Precious? Why isn't anyone taking the hobbits to Isengard? And where are all of the potatoes?
Boil 'em, mash 'em, stick 'em in a stew.
I'm Matt Caron, and Nerdist has let me out of my Gollum editing cave today to hopefully catch you up on all of the histories of Middle-earth and the rest of Arda. This will be a 3-part video series covering the races and peoples of Middle-earth, the characters of the Rings of Power, and the timeline of the Second Age, so that you'll have everything you need to know before starting The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. I'll be giving brief overviews of the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales, and I highly suggest you try reading those books so you can get all of the finer details. We've also got some fantastic articles and explainers over on Nerdist.com. But for the sake of this video, here's your spoiler warning before you get mad and break a toe while kicking a helmet in rage. Okay, so I'm sure that most of us are familiar with fantasy creatures like elves, dwarves, and so on. But Tolkien's lore can get pretty dense, and each race of Middle-earth has rich history spanning over thousands of years. Based on its synopsis, we know that the Rings of Power takes place during Tolkien's Second Age. So let's at least cover how his elves, dwarves, and men came to be where they are for this series. But in order to do so, we need to at least rewind a few thousand years before all of this to what is known as the Years of the Trees and the First Age. Back then, the Valar, the powerful beings that rule over the world of Arda, once created 2 giant lamps to light the world. Melkor, the evil and rebellious of the Valar, destroyed them. So the Valar made the 2 trees of Valinor as a new source of light. In this flashback from the trailers, we can see the Undying Lands, the home of the Valar. And on the horizon, we can see Lorelin, the Golden Tree, and Telperion, the Silver Tree. Melkor destroyed these 2. But before the trees were gone, Feanor, the great craftsman of the Noldoran elves, created the Silmarils, 3 jewels that harness the lights of these trees. And Melkor stole those too. So, Feanor and his sons made a vow to retrieve them no matter what. And we may even see that vow taking place here in this shot. This led to their banishment from the Undying Lands, civil strife between the clans of elves, and untimely demises for Feanor and many of his kin. All of this culminated in the War of Wrath, a giant war of elves, dwarves, men, and even the Valar finally defeating Melkor, who by this point is known as Morgoth. This brought about the end of the First Age. The Silmarils were spread among the stars, the sea, and the earth, and the lands of Beleriand were sunk beneath the ocean, leaving many of its people to leave and inhabit Middle-earth. Again, you can read all about this in much more detail if you read the Silmarillion. Okay, still with me?
I'm going now.
Wait. We're finally at the Second Age. Let's break down at least where the races of elves, dwarves, and men are by this point. The remaining Noldor, the clan of elves that Feanor once led, now reside along the western coast of Middle-earth in Lindon with their High King, Gil-galad. Other notable Noldoran elves are Galadriel and Celebrimbor. There's also Elrond, but he's half-elf and also related to other clans of elves, so we'll get back to him in a later video. Eventually, Galadriel, her husband Celeborn, and their friend Celebrimbor would settle in Eregion, and then Galadriel and Celeborn would also move to rule in Lothlorien. That's where we meet them in the Fellowship of the Ring. The Rings of Power also introduces us to Arondir, a Sylvan elf. These woodland elves never lived in the Undying Lands with the Valar, and in fact never migrated west of the Misty Mountains. Sindarin elves from Beleriand, like King Thranduil and his son Legolas, would eventually join and live with the Sylvan elves in Mirkwood. Okay, let's move on to the dwarves.
What are we waiting for?
We see their stronghold of Khazad-dûm looking a lot nicer than when we saw it in the Fellowship of the Ring. When Beleriand sunk at the end of the First Age, the great dwarven strongholds of Nogrod and Belegost fell into ruin. With their underground kingdoms destroyed, the Broadbeam and the Firebeard clans moved to Khazad-dûm, the home of their brethren, the Longbeards. The Longbeards are also known as Durin's folk, and this family would eventually give us Gimli as well as Thorin and company. The mines of Khazad-dûm held vast amounts of the precious metal mithril, which we can see Durin the Fourth holding here. It was this metal that made up Bilbo and Frodo's chainmail.
Mithril.
And it's what made the dwarves delve too greedily and too deeply.
Run!
Next we come to men, specifically the Numenoreans, the race of men who lived on the island of Numenor. After the War of Wrath, as a thank you to the men who helped fight the evil forces of Morgoth, the Valar gifted the Edain longer lifespans and the island of Numenor.
It is a gift.
The only catch was that these men could never sail west to the Undying Lands out of eyesight of Numenor.
One does not simply walk into Mordor.
Now, Elrond had a brother, Elros, who chose to be mortal among men and became the first king of Numenor, Tar Minyator. The House of Elros would also eventually become the Dunedain and lead us to Aragorn.
You are one of the Dunedain.
Thanks, Eowyn. By the latter half of the Second Age, the Numenoreans became a proud people and began to resent the Valar and the Elves for their immortality. Some Numenoreans maintained their friendship with the Elves, and this group would be known as the Faithful. But the kings of Numenor eventually defied the Valar enough that the Valar sunk the island of Numenor, leaving only the Faithful to escape back to Middle-earth. Think of this as Tolkien's version of Atlantis. I'll also cover this in much more detail when I discuss characters like Ar-Pharazôn, Elendil, and Isildur in a later video.
Isildur!
But during the height of Numenor, the Numenoreans became great mariners and established colonies in Middle-earth. The Numenoreans would guide and teach the tribes and clans of men who lived throughout Middle-earth and beyond. We can see what looks like a Numenorian emissary in this town, with who appears to be Bronwyn. Bronwyn is a new character for this show, and all we know is that she comes from a place called Tir Harad. In Sindarin Elvish, Tir translates to watch, and Harad translates to south. So I'm guessing that Tir Harad is something like the Southern Watch, and could possibly be located near Harad, the land south of Mordor. Lands like Harad and Khand and Rhûn in the Far East were never really fully explored in Tolkien's writings, but we have seen their armies in The Return of the King.
Look, it's an Oliphant.
As we follow the stories of Bronwyn and her son Theo, the Rings of Power looks to delve into these tribes of men as they were guided by Numenorean settlers, but also influenced by the dark forces from the neighboring Mordor. And finally, we come to the small folk of Middle-earth, the Harfoots. You probably thought I was going to say hobbits, weren't you?
Well, no. And yes.
Before we had hobbits in Middle-earth, we had Harfoots, Fallowhides, and Stores, all people of smaller stature that most likely evolved from an offshoot of men. And before all of the Bagginses, Boffins, Tooks, Brandybooks, Grubs, Chubbs, Hornblowers, Bolgers, Bracegirdles, and Proudfoots lived in the Shire, their predecessors lived up and down the Anduin River to the east of the Misty Mountains. The Harfoots and the others won't really migrate west from this area until the Third Age. Some would eventually return, however, including the halfling people from whom Smeagol came. Anyways, this was just a quick summary of some of the many races and peoples of Middle-earth that we will encounter in the Rings of Power. For even more deep dives into the Rings of Power and the rest of Middle-earth, we'll keep you up to date with plenty of articles and explainers over on Nerdist.com. Join me next time as I keep talking Tolkien while I cover the main characters of the series and how their predecessors and families' histories will affect what we can expect to see as the Second Age unfolds. But what did you think? Are you excited to see the world and peoples of Middle-earth before The Lord of the Rings? Did you like half of this video as half as you should like? Or like less than half of it as half as well as it deserved? Let us know in the comments below. And until next time, I bid you all a very fond farewell. Goodbye.